Okay, so it's been a week with the new iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max, and man, it's kind of nuts how much interest these two phones are generating. And I put it that way because when you take a look at what the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max bring to the table, I think a fair argument could be had that most of this is pretty similar to last year. But as someone who's been using the older iPhones up to this point, the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max are in many ways similar, no lie. But there are some key differences that I want to talk about that are honestly both good and bad, so let's get into it. So first, when it comes to form factor and physical design, this is probably the area where there's really no meaningful change from last year. The iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max generally maintain the same dimensions from its predecessors, same build materials, same dust and water resistance rating, and the same styling. The very minute differences between the two will be that the camera hardware is just a bit larger on the 14 Pros, just enough to where you can't use the iPhone 13 Pro cases with the new variants, which is kind of annoying, and it does noticeably protrude out a tad bit more. The other difference would come with some of the new color choices, for example this new deep purple and this space black. The purple is more of an eye catcher, and no lie, it does look nice. And the space black is actually different to last year's midnight color. It's darker and has a stealthier look, and it might low-key be my favorite this year. All that to say, 1 week later, the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max have felt extremely familiar in the hand, and I'm pretty sure minus having one of those new colors, there's almost no way to discern either of these phones from last year's models. That is, if we're only looking at the back of the phones. And that's because one of the biggest visual changes to come to the iPhone 14 Pro is with its display. It's got the same dimensions and the similar hardware, as you do maintain that Super Retina XDR OLED status, though it does have a higher peak brightness in direct sunlight, which is nice. It also maintains Apple's ProMotion technology, where you get up to a 120Hz refresh rate for that ultra silky iOS navigation user experience, and now you could actually clock all the way down to 1Hz to save on battery life. So all of those features around the display are the same as last year. Where you start to see the differences is number one, the new pill cutout at the top here. Apple shrunk down the Face ID hardware to reduce the notch down to this elongated oval shape, and you know what, 1 week later, I have to say on its own, I do find it more distracting than the old notch. Sure, I'm happy that there's a slightly better screen to body ratio, but when the pill cutout is static, I do find it more intrusive when viewing full screen content. Now I'm specifying static here because without a doubt, the main feature that has everyone so excited about the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max is Dynamic Island. Apple, anticipating that this weird pill-shaped cutout would be awkward on its own, they completely redesigned their entire user interface to center most of the iPhone's notifications and multitasking into this now dynamic area of the screen. And look, you can hate on Apple all you want, but you gotta give respect where respect is due, and this is pretty brilliant. It's a total left field approach to solving for the display cutout problem, and the detail and nuance that went into this execution commands respect. And 1 week later, I personally disagree with anyone who classifies Dynamic Island as a gimmick, mainly because it's pretty weaved into the day-to-day user experience. It's not something that you could just avoid. And given that more and more third-party apps are getting in on using the island with each passing day, I can understand, given this feature alone, why folks might be eager to upgrade even from something like the iPhone 13 Pro. Now, the other big noticeable change that comes with the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max is the new always-on display, and I'm just gonna put it out there, I have mixed feelings about it. So yes, they're pretty late to the party, as always-on displays have been around for forever, and in good old Apple fashion, the way the company went about their first implementation of this feature is truly extra. So here's what the always-on display looks like on my Pixel 6 Pro. It's super basic, straight to the point, no frills. And now take a look at the iPhone 14 Pro's always-on display. It's essentially the full-colored lock screen that's just gently dimmed down. And I want to emphasize gently because over the past week, I've thought that the display is just straight up on multiple times a day. This is especially true for the notifications. I mean, just look at this. It doesn't look like there's any dimming going on whatsoever. And in a way, this is pretty cool, and I do generally like this feature, even though it is taking some getting used to. But the main issue that I have with it 1 week later, I'm fairly confident that it's having an impact on my battery life. As someone who's experienced the glory of the iPhone 13 Pro Max's bulletproof battery life, it pains me to say that the battery life so far in the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max hasn't been able to meet that super high bar. To be clear, it isn't bad. You're still gonna have enough battery to comfortably make it through a day of moderate use, but you will notice a dip in performance if you're using the phone a lot, especially in bright settings. The new peak brightness is awesome, but I think it's the main culprit behind why battery performance on this year's Pros is not as good, and I think the always-on display only exacerbates this issue. Now, I will say the last couple days with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, battery performance has gotten better. I'm not sure if it's because the phone is settling in or if I'm just using it less, but if you are concerned with battery life, you can turn the always-on display off in the settings, which I'm sure will make a noticeable difference. Now, the last thing about the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max that I want to talk about is the new cameras. The new hardware brings a larger 48 megapixel sensor to the 14 Pro's main cameras, as well as improved ultra-wide and selfie cameras, all to say that I was pretty excited to see what all of this would translate to when it comes to overall image quality. And I gotta be honest here, 1 week later, it's kind of disappointing. And I'm not suggesting that the still image quality is bad, it's still one of the best coming out of any mobile device right now. It's just that it's eerily similar to what the iPhones were pumping out already. If I were to really try and say what the main difference is, there's a tad bit more detail and contrast to the images coming out of the iPhone 14 Pro and some better overall performance with low light photography. And that makes sense with the larger sensor and the larger megapixel count, but I'm not seeing anything that I would consider to be a night and day difference. From a functionality standpoint, the new 14 Pros also have a built-in 2x zoom on the camera app, which I will say is quite useful. And even though it is a digital crop into the larger sensor, it does work really well. But an issue that I ran into with the main camera is the minimal focus distance. Like, you really can't get that near to the subject that you're trying to shoot. It'll either switch you to the macro shot, which uses the ultra-wide sensor, or if you bypass that, the image will just straight up not be in focus. It kind of reminds me of the focusing issue the S20 Ultra had when it first went with this crazy 100 megapixel camera, and it's pretty annoying, I'm not gonna lie. All in all though, the still images coming out of the iPhone 14 Pro are still fantastic and could be considered the best coming out of any phone right now. It's just not the big leap that I was hoping for. And unfortunately, the same could be said about video quality, but kind of to a lesser degree. And I say that because generally the 4K video coming out of the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max is very similar, if not identical in quality to last year's performance, but it's still the best by a far margin compared to what's out there, and Apple did add some interesting new video features. For example, you can now shoot in Apple's cinematic mode in 4K at up to 30 frames per second. This does actually make me want to use this feature more than it did in the past, and though it's not perfect, the footage does look pretty good. Another new feature is the new action stabilization mode. This again works surprisingly well when you're running gun shooting. You do have to settle for a slightly lower resolution and a bit of a crop into the sensor, which I think is totally fair given the results. It does use the ultra-wide camera though, and in order for the footage to come out good, you are going to need an abundance of light, so shooting indoors in this mode is going to be tough. Now personally, I'm not sure how often I'm going to use either of these features. I'm still super happy with the regular 4K video that's coming out of the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max. And despite it being similar to last year, I think the best way to put it is that the cameras overall perform really great. Just don't expect anything major in terms of changes. So that ultimately brings us to the million-dollar question, are the iPhone 14 Pros worth it? Personally, if I already had either the 13 Pro or the 13 Pro Max, I wouldn't upgrade. There's way too much overlap here and potentially some downside when it comes to battery life, and I wouldn't be eager to drop another hefty bag on yet another expensive iPhone. I would say the earliest you should start considering an upgrade is if you're on an iPhone 12 or anything older. The benefits of ProMotion, the improved cameras, better battery life, and the addition of dynamic island and the always-on display makes for a pretty compelling package at that point. It wouldn't be the worst thing holding out though. I do have a feeling that Apple is going to do a pretty significant design overhaul with the iPhone 15 that I'm hoping really freshens up the lineup. But hey, that's just me, and I want to know what you guys think. What do you guys think about the iPhone 14 Pro? Do you think it's worth the upgrade? Or is it too similar to what's already out there? Curious to get your thoughts. Let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments down below. Okay, that's about it for this review. Don't forget to leave me a thumbs up if you guys found it useful. Again, I really appreciate it. Check out these other reviews if you're looking for more, and I'll see you guys in the next one.